Hey people, this is my sister Laura.
Hey, this is my sister Jean. We're the Reclamation Sisters, and today we're going to talk about grief. So you mentioned to me once a lesson you were doing with your clients about disenfranchised grief, and I don't know what that means. So why don't you talk to me about
so we have so many types of grief that we go through as human beings, and I think that people just kind of mash everything together like a mixed up sundae. And what we need to understand is there's variations of grief and types of grief. Grief being a response to a loss in our life, right? And that's any loss. Grief is the most selfish emotional response we have as human beings because it's about who?
It's about yourself.
It's not about the person that's no longer here.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that people hear all these things about the stages of grief, but what they don't understand is that's more about the person who has been given a diagnosis of long-term or terminal illness that they bargain and come to acceptance and then move forward. People in the grieving process don't go through that. We go through like a U back and forth, and we swing depending on the triggers and our emotional response to any day or situation. We have collective grief, and that's like anytime there's like a mass shooting or there's a tornado or a hurricane or 9/11, anytime that like the community comes together and as a community we grieve the loss of, like when the president was shot and assassinated, there's a collective response of grief. But most importantly is to understand it's when like there's mass shootings or something where the whole community in which you reside loses something.
What's the difference between grief and sadness?
Sadness is a core emotion. Like I'm sad, and I'm sad because of things that happen.
Like in my mind, I guess I kind of thought grief was just like extreme sadness.
No,
it's not.
No. So grief is your response to loss. Think of the cute little movie Inside Out.
Yeah.
And each one of those little colors is a core emotion, right?
Yeah,
but there's no grief in there. And then anticipatory is when you know that the passing is going to happen. Ambiguous is more like, you know, my child was taken. Are they alive? Are they dead? Are they safe? Did they run away? Will I ever see them again? So different types of the grieving process, but what we have to look at in healing is disenfranchised grief. Disenfranchised grief started with Dr. Doka, who said he was working with a woman, and she was explaining in a divorce group that her husband, who had stepped out on her and they had been separated for many, many years, and he had immediately remarried, he had gotten a terminal illness diagnosis, and when he died, she was almost shamed for grieving. Although they had children together and had spent 25 years together, she was almost shamed for grieving his death. And so why would you do that? You aren't with him. He did these terrible things to you, but not looking at that we have a connection and experiences with these people that we spent a quarter of our life with. So it became a point of research and understanding that any time that somebody loses something that society doesn't recognize or value, we put somebody in the process of disenfranchised grieving. If you were imprisoned, you lose your children. You lose the right to bear arms. You lose the right to drive. You lose your freedom. But other people are like, well, if you wouldn't have done that, you wouldn't be in prison. But so we're not recognizing the loss that somebody goes through. People lose their teeth in addiction. They lose their right to drive. They lose their children. They lose their self-esteem, their self-confidence, any worth that other people have in them. They lose their families. Their families leave them. Their friends leave them. If you spent your whole life being raised by lawyers and you were told you were going to go to law school and you started your own practice and you had one drink and you were driving home and there was an accident and then you ended up with a DUI or like that person died and you actually were incarcerated, not only are you grieving the fact that you've lost your connection with your family, you're probably never going to practice law. And that's what you were raised to do. Grieving in recovery is all the things that we lose in the process of use and our family loses in the process of having a relationship with us, or any person has. Say you were never married and you know, in the last part of your life, you had a little dog and you lived alone and that little dog was all you had. And somebody was like, but it's just a dog. No, it's not just a dog. It's their companion. It's who they communicate with. It's what drives that connection for them. So when we dismiss or devalue what somebody is saying that they're struggling with, we create disenfranchised grief. And that's one of the things that we try to explain to people it's what drives us to connect is I may have lost X, Y, and Z, and you may have lost your child, and I don't have a child, but I may have lost a child in another way, or we've both lost our licenses, or we've both lost our freedoms, or our friends, or connection. What the rooms of recovery allow is that we can grieve collectively the things that other people don't understand that we're grieving.
Very interesting. I had no idea.
Yeah, so grieving in that sense, but what we have to do is be able to have empathy for anybody going through something, and also kindness and sympathy for their experience, but also just hold space for somebody or a family or the process of healing to happen, because when we put our own judgment and our own value system onto somebody, we create a space in which they can't be authentic and vulnerable and thrive to recover. So grieving is humongous in this process, and you have to look at what a parent grieves, what a sibling grieves, what children grieve that their parent is not there, and how many people are actually grieving the loss of their loved one because of addiction issues and not having that person ever return because of overdose issues. So grief is enormous. If you struggle with grief, please know that most churches have a grief support group. There is a grieving 12-step program you're able to engage in intherooms.com. Seek out individual counseling, have a conversation with somebody that you trust and can hold space for you, or, seek a mentor or a pastor, but don't feel alone in your grieving process.
And we'll put some links to some resources on our website. It's reclamationsisters.com/resources. You can check there for some help too. Thanks, guys.
See you next time. Oh my God, I'm dying. I smell and I'm dying. Jesus, polyester is a bad choice.